My research question is on to what degree has Canada mitigated the harmful effects of the Indian Act on Indigenous communities? This is done by Barakat Stefanos. My thesis is the harmful effects of the Indian Acts are still seen today, as reconciliation has been nothing but a performance that lacks meaningful action. These are my three supporting arguments that I used in my essay. The first one is the performance argument. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper was the first Canadian leader that officially apologized for residential schools. He apologized on behalf of the Canadian government and called it a sad history of our country. This apology came 11 years after the last residential school was closed, but still acknowledged this still acknowledged all the pain and suffering to the victims that they went through. To the Indigenous company in the community, this was seen as a monumental moment that signified the acknowledgement of a horrible event. Yet a year later, in the Pittsburgh Summit, in a speech to promote Canadian stability and economy on an international stage, Harper stated that Canada had no history of colonialism. Just a year ago, the government saw Indigenous affairs as a priority, but when it got into the international stage, the government doesn't only fail to show remorse for the harm done, but outright denies the suffering of the community. This shows that Harper's apology was nothing but a performance. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced his intention to create the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Yet many Indigenous don't understand the concept of reconciliation, as the Canadian government still takes Indigenous people to court over land claims, thus causing mistrust within thus causing Indigenous people to mistrust the Canadian government, showing Indigenous affairs as a performance that lacks meaningful action to them. The next is the lack of intent. The lack of intent refers to childcare agencies, education, and justice systems that have been slower to enact meaningful changes that seek to improve their relationship with Indigenous people. This can be for justice, the incarceration rates of Indigenous people is 9 times higher than non-Indigenous people in the 2021 year. 9 times higher. In the first graph here, we see the education rate in each province, as the difference between the non-Indigenous and Indigenous. As Nunavut, we see a whole 50%, a 45% difference in education rates. As we see in Nova Scotia, it's a little bit closer, but we see this huge gap between education rates between them. The missing and murdered Indigenous women. In 2015, the federal government opened a public inquiry, but only after years of advocacy from Indigenous communities. Unsolved murders against Indigenous women. Yet 6 years later, in 2021, we see that Indigenous women are still twice as likely to experience sexual abuse by inmates, by an intimate partner, and are more likely to be a victim of a violent attack compared to non-Indigenous women. In the second graph, we see the second graph shows that members of the Indigenous community 6 and up, and whether they state they're happy or not. We see in 2001, the members of Indigenous community believe they are happier compared to 2012. We see a huge difference, as in Nunavut, there's a whole 15% difference. Just within 10 years, the Indigenous people in Canada have identified 10% less than Nunavut to be less happy. Okay, for the last argument, it's the health crisis argument. Prior to colonization, Indigenous people possessed rich and diverse healing systems. It's once new settlers brought, colonizers or new settlers brought new and contagious diseases such as smallpox and influenza, which placed these healing systems under a considerable strain. The arrival of Europeans to North America introduced these unfamiliar diseases that damaged indigenous healing systems. Then amendments to the Indian Act in the late 19th and 20th centuries criminalized and prohibited indigenous healing and religious practices. So these laws combined with their poor living conditions, poverty, racism, loss of land, declining access to food resources had devastating consequences on the health of indigenous people. As we can see today in the graph here, we see that non-indigenous people are more likely to live a longer life compared to indigenous people in First Nations, Métis, and Inuits. For the health crisis today, the Aboriginal population exhibits higher rates of chronic illnesses such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, musculoskeletal conditions, cancer, mental illness, and HIV/AIDS compared to the general population. Many reserves also continue to have limited to no access to clean water. In mental health, we see the rate of suicide in Inuit people alone remains one of the highest in the world, as they are 11 times more likely to kill themselves compared to the average Canadian citizen. Suicide and self-inflicted injuries also remain one of the leading causes of death among Indigenous people under the age of 44. Through all these arguments, we show that Canada still has a lot, the Canadian government still has a lot to do in order to mitigate the harmful effects of the Indian Act. Thank you, and this was my presentation.